there's some things that surprised me or interested me as a historian. I mean, one of them was the way in which in 1932 Stalin is still so focused on the Civil War. This was revealing to me how much how bothered he was by the Ukrainian Revolution and by the rebellion of 1918 and 19, and how much this still was part of his thinking 20 years later. I suppose, though, that if I understand your question, you're asking what's shocking about the famine story. And of course, there are a lot of things that are shocking about it. It's a very difficult story to write. For me, it's even more difficult than the Gulag, which is another book that I wrote. Because Gulag, people left and they wrote very beautiful memoirs, and there's some kind of people have learned something, or they learn about human morality and they can write something. The famine, really, there's nothing good you can say about it. Nothing, it's a terrible tragedy. It ends awfully. A lot of illiterate, peasants die. But I suppose the most shocking thing really is you realize how indifferent most of society was. I mean, most people knew there was a famine. People in the cities knew, people in Russia knew, and yet there was never any reaction to it. There was never any attempt to commemorate it. And the people who'd carried it out never paid any price for it. So the famine, as you know, it wasn't caused by chaos. It was caused by people going into the homes of peasants and taking their food. And so there were some people who did this. They were the activists who went from house to house and confiscated food. And they were indifferent to having done that. They never were punished for doing it. They lived on. There's no evidence there was any terrible moment when they felt guilty. And it's this indifference that's probably the most shocking.
How do you think this event in particularly influenced kind of the identity and the psyche of the nation? In a way that, for a while it was concealed, though everybody knew. At the same time, there is a feeling of the victimhood. But in another case, any kind of this tragedy has some also like a lot of a negative impact on there.
So I think you're right. The secrecy is very important. The fact that it was covered up and people weren't allowed to talk about it. And that meant that probably added to the sense that you've had in Ukraine. Actually, you've had in Ukraine for for a long time. Of this mistrust for the state and this feeling that the state is somehow alien, that we don't trust it, whatever they say is a lie, we don't believe it. And this feeling that, we are the people over here and the state is over there. And this is a problem in today's Ukraine. How do you create a sense of patriotism if you have people who don't trust their institutions? And on the other side, how do you make the institutions feel that they are responsible to ordinary people? The cause of corruption really, the source of corruption in Ukraine and in other places is this lack of sense of responsibility. People who have political power feel that entitles them to steal. And, some of this feeling dates from this period, both because of the famine and because of the assault on the intellectual class that accompanied it.
And what are the particular, Soviet strategies to make it happen, the society is so indifferent, to have this way that, with the support of its own population, that tragedy is possible?
So the kind of Soviet propaganda against the peasantry, and in particular against kulaks, begins already in the 1920s. Actually it begins at this time of the Civil War. And in the late 1920s and then at the time of collectivization, it becomes extreme, it's constant. And the argument from the state is that these kulaks are standing in the way of the revolution. And all of your problems, you, the proletariat, you people in Kyiv or in Kharkiv or in Moscow, all of your problems, the reason why you are poor is because these people are stealing your food. And these old, illiterate, backwards peasants are keeping the food for themselves, and that's why we're all so hungry. And this line is repeated over and over again and at the same time, inside villages, there are these very sharp divisions are made. And favoritism and help and so on are shown to those peasants who will cooperate with the authorities, and those ones who won't cooperate or who won't join the collective farms or who who are more wealthy or more successful, they are kulaks. And the policy is to both make the cities hate the countryside and also to make inside the villages these two different groups fight against each other. So it's the deliberate creation of what we would now call partisanship, and this division of the country into parts, and this feeling that, this creation of hatred between different groups. And it was very, very successful.
Is it in that way something unique, or, we can compare that particular, way the system work with something else, with some other trade?
Look, this is how partisanship works now. You don't have to, you can look at modern Ukraine, you can look at other, lots of other countries. What do there are politicians who seek to unify people and seek to create a message that will bring a country together, and then there are politicians who seek to divide people and speak only to their constituency. This is how Donald Trump won the election in the United States, by speaking to one group. This is how Yanukovych sought to win elections here, by if you can divide people and if you can make your group of activists really angry and support you and back you, and then you can win power. It's a tactic that we see in lots of places.
In your previous interview, you mentioned that that the differentiation between the de facto, what you would consider the genocide, what is the legal term, and really, what is the most important to understand what had happened for Ukrainians rather than to prove it was a genocide. But still, in all the international communication, especially with, for instance, with the Russians or with the post-Soviet, there is this question, was it? Why Ukrainians are pushing? Why I think this issue is still so irritating to a lot of people in Russia in the way we communicate, and in particular Holodomor. In the end, it's such a tragedy that you don't. Sometimes when there is a tragedy, why you deny that somebody has bigger or like a smaller or a scale? You understand, like in a case of Holocaust, you don't deny something bad happened, just having that something worse happened to somebody else. And that's exactly what's happening to Holodomor, and that's probably which is striking.
I think it's because there is, in the end, a deep connection that the Holodomor was connected to. It happened in part. It was partly an attack on the Ukrainian national movement. Stalin wanted to repress the peasants in order to prevent this creation of this flowering of an independent or a sovereign Ukraine. And then I think it's the case that the Ukrainian national movement in the late 1980s and early 1990s also began to talk about the Holodomor once again. And I think the Russians dislike it because it's connected in their heads to the drive for Ukrainian sovereignty and independence. And it's one of the aspects of history that makes the Ukrainians different from the Russians. There's a Russian narrative about Soviet history, which is we were all in this together, and we fought Hitler, and we constructed the Soviet Union, and we rebuilt Kyiv in the 1950s, and so on. And this was all something that we all did together. And the Holodomor is a story that shows there were, in the end, actually some differences inside the Soviet Union, and there were different experiences. And I think that bothers particularly this Russian government, which I think is really, fear isn't really the right word, but really dislikes the example that Ukraine is setting. And actually maybe I should use that. Is afraid of having protests in Russia of the kind that you had here on the Maidan. And I think they connect the famine, the arguments about the famine, to that story.
At the same time, what would you think is the way to remember the Holodomor?
So, I've said this today a couple of times. In my view, the best thing you could do to commemorate the victims of the famine is to build a society where this can never happen again. To think about, when you talk about Ukraine and when you talk about what kind of country you want to live in, think about building a society where this is impossible. And this is really the best thing you can do. I mean, of course you should teach people the story, and of course you should argue about the story. And there are very, very good, Ukrainian historians who've been writing very well about it. I don't know how well it's taught in schools or how much debate there is about it. But this is obviously, it should be a part of civic education as well as a part of history education. Here is a disaster that happened in our country. Teaching people and talking about how to make sure what are the institutions, what are the ways of thinking we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. This is the best thing you could do.
Looking at the 20s and early 30s and that time Ukrainian communist leadership, in a way there is this discussion about authenticity of part of the communism, which was, in this country in particular, it was not just brought by Lenin here. Ukraine has own communists, so a lot of had this tragic destiny after they committed suicide, knowing what happened in 30s. At the same time, we now having this really chaotic process of decommunization. When there are other people who would say, let's forget about them. Everybody who was communist was, a colonizer. So from what you, while working with this archive, how would you would differentiate or describe the particularly, this Ukrainian communism within the Soviet,
So, well, there's
also how for Ukraine do you think what are the challenges on really researching, talking about that, because there is one word, communism.
There were Ukrainian communists. There was a group of Ukrainian so-called national communists who believed that, through communism, the nation would realize itself. And so who believed in speaking Ukrainian and in teaching in Ukrainian and so on. But at the same time, they were Marxists who wanted to belong to the Soviet Union. And that was one argument that was made at the time. And actually, a lot of those people were killed in 1934, and if not in 1934, then in 1937, as Stalin purged the party and made a much more Stalinist-type communist party. But I think, for Ukraine, a very interesting part of the debate and something to understand is not just these communists at the high level, but to understand the activists at the village level. Because at the village level, there were two kinds of people in these activist groups, and some of them were people from, Moscow or people from Kyiv, these kind of, Komsomol or Bolshevik leaders who came down to collect grain from the villages, but some of them were local people. So there were also Ukrainians, in other words, other Ukrainian peasants who cooperated, who stole the food from their neighbors, and in order to give it to the state, and knew that they were allowing people to die. And of course, you have to understand many of those people were doing it because they were hungry, or because they thought, if I don't do this, my children will die, or because they were afraid and they thought they didn't have choices. But nevertheless, putting them back into the story and understanding how this was not only, of course this was imposed from Moscow, and of course this was a Soviet plan, and of course it would never have happened without Stalin, but how did Stalin get collaborators, both in the Ukrainian Communist Party, but also these village level collaborators? It's very important to understand that story, to think about it, to digest it, not so much in order to lay blame or to make judgments. I think it's pointless, talking about who is good and who is evil 80 years ago, but just to understand where that behavior came from. This would be a very useful thing to do here.
At this stage, you were always, I think, learning Russia, learning this region. We always were a bit fed up with the conspiracy theories which are often, discussed in Russia about the way the world is governed. And what's happening now, sometimes it's, when you now watch the US television, when you really read a lot of papers, you just again speaking about all these conspiracies, collusion. How do you feel about that? You're commenting and you're writing a lot about Trump, and in the end, it's still kind of the same story of a still not very, it's somehow clear, but there is no direct evidence about the Trump-Putin relations. So how we can get and report and talk about that without having that mindset?
Well, actually, the strange thing about this Trump story is that although it's a very weird story and very different from anything else, there's no kind of precedent in American politics, we do know a lot. There are sort of 30, 40 different meetings that people from the Trump campaign had with Russians. There are, multiple emails. There are lots of witnesses. There's lots of, there's actually, it's gone well beyond conspiracy theory. It's pretty well evidenced. We're talking about something that's real. And the strange part of it is the fact that he denies it, and that, we have never had a president who lies like this one lies. And he lies blatantly. He lies all the time. He lies about stupid things like how many people come to his inauguration, and he lies about, he's capable of saying one thing in the morning and then denying in the afternoon that he said it. So this is the thing I think that makes the United States feel so weird right now is really that. It's the strange behavior of this president. We'd never had one who was so constantly dishonest all the time.
But at the same time, why it's so difficult, even with the Mueller investigation? He started with the story with the Manafort. We reported a lot about that, but then there was this, what we would consider the hardcore evidence of Papadopoulos. Referring that he talked to a professor. In the end, we understand that professor was kind of somebody who was exaggerating a lot of the things and was also a kind of an odd personality.
Well, all these people are odd.
Yeah, they're all odd in the end. So, and it's lasting for so long.
No, it will last for a long time because Mueller is trying to indict. He's not trying to prove that it happened. He's trying to indict them. He's trying to put people in jail, and so that requires a lot of evidence, in our system. So. That's why it's taking so long. Proving that there was contact between Trump and the Russians, well, we proved that already. That's, we know. That's now, there are lots and lots of story. We have confessions and evidence, and it's all true. But Mueller is trying to prove that they broke the law, and so that's much harder to prove, and it's going to take a long time.
But when you really travel in the US and talk, you really understand that there is the things which are broken in the system. So really, how would you look and how those things could be fixed without just, when you talk today a lot to the Democrats, it still feels that they are licking the wounds and trying to explain what had happened.
Yeah, no, they need to, it's true the Democrats need to move forward and come up with a positive message that can unite people again. It can't be a message about racism, and it can't be something that divides people again according to what identity they have. And I think there are actually quite a lot of good Democratic politicians, even in the Senate and in the House. There are some very good people. Nobody's yet emerged as the kind of new leader of the party, but that might only happen closer to the time of the next election.
We recently have the Russia Today and Sputnik registered as the foreign agents. What do you think? How effective is that? How necessary was that?
I don't know. I think it's a bit silly. I don't think it makes any difference whether they're registered as foreign agents. If it were me, I would have wanted a different arrangement. I would have said that if Russia Today and Sputnik are to be allowed to continue to broadcast in the United States, then Voice of America and Radio Liberty should be allowed to broadcast in Russia. And I would, okay, this is your, government television, this is our government television and our government radio, and of course they can't broadcast. They're very hard to obtain them in Russia, and I would have made the deal something about that. But I'm not sure I see what the point of doing that was. I mean, it's sort of, I suppose it stigmatizes them a little bit. Maybe it means that people will think twice about appearing on it. That's probably good.